From seemingly out of nowhere, a new kind of cop emerged. A green-skinned powerhouse with a fin on his head, but no memories inside it, who joined the Chicago PD in tackling its supercrime problem. He became so effective in a short amount of time, other cities would ask for his aid when they were facing threats bigger than they could handle. This is the man who would become known as the Savage Dragon. Hello, I'm the Angry Spork. I remember on my 10th birthday going to Meijer with my mom, and she let me pick out a Batman toy. She later surprised me with a second gift. Knowing I liked the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon, she sneakily bought me a comic featuring the heroes in a half-shell, which is what I'm reviewing today. I'm taking issue with Savage Dragon number 2, so let's stroll down memory lane and see if this comic makes us want to turn the page, or turn our heads. The cover features the Turtles dropping down on the unsuspecting title character, as he looks all cool with his muscle shirt, sunglasses, and big honkin' gun. The only way he could look more movie-worthy is if he looked just like Dwayne Johnson, but was composed entirely of quips from every action flick since 1980.
We put our faith in Blast Hard Cheese. Big McLarge Huge.
Slab Bulkhead.
Fridge Large Meats.
Written by Eric Larson, who also did the penciling and inking, helped on art by Steve Oliff and Ruben Rude. I imagine because Pauline Polite had a prior commitment. We begin at the Chicago Police Department, as a woman walks in a silver form-fitting suit, gloves and boots adorned with small darts, who is ogled by the male officers, which is why one of their female colleagues calls them pigs. And maybe that's appropriate, because this guy here is not being very subtle with all that slobber.
Ah, good boy, little drooly.
And here I thought 7 of 9 threw out that uniform to swap between burgundy and blue. One of them even starts hitting on her, but she quickly tells him to drop dead. This isn't Marvel or DC, probably less chance he'd be brought back 7 months later, so that seems like a pretty serious rejection there. She's stopped by Officer Wilde, Dragon's partner, who asks what she's doing here. The blonde introduces herself as Dart, a crime fighter out of Detroit, who was called in by Captain Stewart, told to arrive secretly in case of any suspicious activity. Apparently, Officer Dragon keeps getting loaned out, and things go to hell whenever he's gone. Yeah, we really need to stop printing his absence in the community newsletter. Wilde is glad to have more super types on the force, something Dragon has been suggesting for a while, and when Dart asks where Greenie is, the code blue alarm sounds. What's going on? Dragon's out of town right now, so naturally all hell's broken loose.
Hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Feels a little redundant to use the same basic terminology 1 page later. Would have been saved a bit if it was a more intentional reiteration, like Wilde prefacing it with "like you said." Or maybe Dart's initial dialogue could have phrased things differently, putting it a bit more mildly or something. So Wilde and the new super cop head out, with all the other officers behind them armed and ready, as Dart is welcomed to Chicago. I like it already. Wait until there's a Bulls game against the Pistons, and you instinctively root for your home team. Then we'll see how well you like it. We go to Manhattan on a 2-page spread, Dragon narrating how he doesn't like being here, too many weirdos, and wonders why other superheroes like Supreme or Youngblood aren't dealing with this city's problems, like there aren't any native do-gooders. He's found himself returning often, ever since defeating that insane vigilante chiropractor. Whether that means it was a vigilante called chiropractor, or that he leaps out of nowhere and adjusts people's spines without a license, I couldn't tell you. Maybe it's both. Tonight, he's been called in to investigate some living gargoyle grabbing old ladies. This is New York, so maybe one of Goliath's clan was just helping those women cross the street, and this is all just one big misunderstanding. The comic doesn't seem to waste any time, because our first look at Finhead in this issue is also our first look at the Ninja Turtles, all leaping at him from his 6 o'clock. They strike all at once, swarming him and getting in a few hits, but are effortlessly knocked back, as with Michelangelo. Nobody makes me look bad! 2 words for you. Michael Bay.
Not monsters.
Leo cuts his big fancy rifle before he can use it to ventilate any of their shells, and get in a few more strikes, Mikey declaring their victory, but Dragon doesn't quite agree. Their tussle takes them over the ledge, and they fall into the alley below. with what looks like some green fluid erupting from their impact. Jumping jackrabbits! Is that what's been inside those Hostess Ninja Turtle pies this whole time? No, they're each of them intact, as Dragon clarifies he's a cop, and they are under arrest. The turtles seem to finally recognize him as the famous cop out of Chicago, somehow mistook for the rumored killer gargoyle they were hunting, supposedly because it was so dark to them. The ninja introduce themselves and ask if the officer will stand in their way of their intent on defeating the creature. Dragon says he's here to take that same threat down, and is fine with letting them help bag the sucker, even if they're the weirdest looking ninja he's ever heard of.
Yeah! Yeah! Yeah!
As they get to another roof, he tells them to be alert and not move unless he tells them. But that doesn't stop Mikey from harassing Leonardo for mistaking the cop for their target in the first place. The leader hits back that his brother leaped in without a second thought, and they start hurling insults and grabbing each other's faces. Butthead! Pompous jerk!
I thought insurance salesmen were pushy.
Dragon separates them, raising each up by their shells, only tolerating their nonsense because he's a nice guy, but he does have limits. If just deadlifting them doesn't do anything, try jiggling them in the air, see if that calms them down. That's when, on another two-pager, they're confronted by a giant stone gargoyle flying in the air. They go in for the attack. The officer punching its leg, or tail, or whatever, but gets kicked off, crashing into the roof. The turtles think their new ally is seriously hurt, so launch themselves at the creature, but Dragon's actually fine, as he immediately returns to the fight. And just like this book's star, the creature doesn't seem to be taking much damage either, even starting to breathe fire on the brothers. Dragon, figuring they're close enough, delivers a massive punch that shatters the gargoyle into stone bits, its remains raining on the roof below along with our heroes.
My angel of the night.
Leo suggests the granite statue was able to fly via magic, which Finhead scoffs at. Do you have a better explanation?
Yeah, maybe it was the Tooth Fairy, or the Easter Bunny. Did you consider that?
That's ridiculous. There were no colored eggs inside the monster, and the Tooth Fairy strictly and exclusively works with enamel only. I guess that's why you are Officer Dragon and not Detective Dragon. They're observed by a woman in the shadows, whose costume makes Dart look downright modest. Can you tell my mom didn't look through the comic before she decided to buy it? Setting aside the odd bustier that was not exactly uncommon in the 90s, what's the deal with those straps on her arms, with empty straps or tags attached to them? Seems really impractical, and that's saying something for this era of comics. It's got to be so time-consuming to slip them on one by one. Either going bare-armed or using actual sleeves would save her at least 10 minutes of suiting up. And that hair, yeesh! That's got to take hairspray, gel, and bendable wires to get right. When you're going for sexy, but you end up with a tailor's twisted fever dream after they dropped a psychedelic mushroom in their Mike's Hard Lemonade. Dragon does some weird flexing pose, like he's checking out his pecs in a mirror that only he can see, and figures the enemy is finished. Despite Leonardo suggesting someone had to have been controlling the statue, Dragon would rather head back to his home turf, and they exchange farewells. Though the cop is curious what the whole gargoyle kidnapping fiasco was all about. Turns out it was all part of a scheme to get people to invest in Bitcoin. Those cryptocurrency miners are getting really aggressive. We get another page set in DeKalb, Illinois, where a kid knocks on the door of a house asking if anyone's home. The door swings open, and he runs in terror at the sight of blood and two desiccated corpses on the floor. And as the kid is already gone, someone speaks from beyond a door to the basement. Kind of an extreme way to avoid paying the paperboy, isn't it? The rest of the issue is largely unrelated. A couple pin-ups, Dragon facing giant robots, apparently led by some other woman that doesn't like pants, and then him in a firefight leaping over a squad car. Then a few pages of a separate story, also written by Larson, featuring the hero Star. He's another fill-in super, though this is to cover for a different trip Dragon took, and fighting a villain named Inferno. Not really sure what Star's powers are supposed to be, since he basically jumps around, snarks at the villain, even suggesting they call it quits and grab some brewskis. Not that it works. He does win by breaking a gas tanker that seems to have been somewhat accidental, and causing a huge explosion, but in the process he gets pretty messed up by it all.
So much for my trademark hair.
He can kiss his contract with Vidal Sassoon goodbye. Several more pinups, not going to show them all since a few are characters that weren't featured and I don't recognize, and then a backup that you had to turn the comic over to read. Its page is upside down if you continue with the Savage Dragon story, as I recall. Vanguard number 0, featuring the title character bursting out of the main cover. I say as I recall, because years ago I sold off a bunch of my comics, including this one. Some might think that's a bit callous since it was a birthday gift, but I held on to it for years and eventually realized it didn't inspire the same feelings it once did, and I don't think my mom is so materialistic that she'd be terribly upset by it. Besides, I did get it signed by Eric Larson at a convention, so maybe that helps someone resell it for a nice chunk of change. Another Larson co-creation, this story is written by its other creator, Gary Carlson, with Tom Coker, Jim Sinclair, and Ruben Rude on art, because Noel Nonchalant was too casual about the job, probably. It sees the main character infiltrate a tower, waxing poetic and melodramatic in his narration. Melopomatic? But he does have a sense of humor as well, as he mows down alien enemies before facing Earth's horror movie villains, and complains to someone named Wally that these aren't authentic aliens. Yeah, but since the Dark Universe flopped, they're a lot cheaper. I mean, wouldn't they be aliens to him? Vanguard then faces duplicates of Image characters, as well as an obscured and thus legally protected cameo by a certain Claude X-Man.
You know nothing, little man. Next time, I use these.
But eventually he's had enough and calls for Wally, his one-eyed robot buddy, who apparently screwed up this training session with his TV watching. I suppose Vanguard must have watched some too, since being stationed here 3 months back, which would explain his use of phrases like cotton-picking minute and Ren and Stimpy quotes like happy happy joy joy. Anyway, he's trying to be prepared in case their enemies in the Terrace Combine attack, but Wally says, since Earth isn't on their star charts, only discovered by accident a year ago, it's highly unlikely. And he'd rather watch his 287 television channels. Man, his processors would probably explode at the streaming we have today. The issue ends with the V-Man thinking Wally forgot to turn off the simulator and injures his hand when he punches Supreme, who wants to know what the alien is doing on Earth and when he plans to leave. Though with that Bubbles arrow, maybe his cape is asking that. That, aside from the tangent with the backups, was Savage Dragon number 2, and it was alright. This felt a lot more casual than other crossovers, like seeing Ghost Rider show up in X-Men, which yes did happen and I'll probably review that at some point. This was perhaps because Image had the license for Turtles comics around this time, and this was to establish them as canon. Being the first and only Savage Dragon comic I've ever owned, I didn't know anything about his amnesia or interpersonal relationships, but it does give you some idea of what the main character is like. Super strong, isn't to be trifled with, can be very gruff, but seems willing to overlook being attacked from nowhere over mistaken identity. That of a monster made of stone. They said it was because it was dark and they only saw him from the back to make it seem more plausible, even though you'd think one of the turtles, like the smart one, would have noticed something during the fight. Though if that brawl had been colored too darkly, that would have created an entirely different problem. The turtles' personalities don't seem all that different from each other here. Honestly, I thought that was Raphael giving Leo grief before I noticed the nunchucks in his belt. I mean, Raph is often the hothead challenging Leo, not Mikey. They don't really let their individuality shine, since you could switch their dialogue among them and nothing would really change. Not to mention, their tactics are mostly hit the enemy all at once, and seem rather sloppy in doing so, since Raph hits Leo by mistake. They fight Dragon, realize who he is, and rather quickly develop solidarity with him, because Green Baldies had to stick together, which, okay, being similarly unlike humanity, the turtles seeking some kind of friendship with him does make sense, though Dragon seems rather aloof about it. Maybe because he's so accepted by his own precinct, by regular humans asking him to save their towns and so on, and because he just wants to get back home. I get it. I hate traveling too. He's kind of dismissive, but not a total jerk, except to several people, including colleagues, in the first issue as I skimmed. But to be fair, in that same story, he's more compassionate to two suspects he tussles with that he's fine letting go, not unlike what happened here. So perhaps he just has more complex relationships in his normal stomping grounds. I thought the art was fine, though the guest starring terrapins seemed rather round. Not fat, just that their bodies have less of a V shape most other designs have given them over the years. There's definitely some standard 90s cheesecake, only on a couple of pages, but it can lean a little into the unrealistic, like with Dart's waist, and this mystery woman's costume, just the design alone, it can make you think, well, it's unique, and you kind of take that for what it's worth. This was a nice little nostalgic jaunt, looking at one of the earliest books in my collection. I likely read it a bunch of times, since this was when I only had a handful of comics. It's not bad, especially if you don't mind some of the artistic trends of the decade, just not as bombastic as other crossovers. And being the second in an ongoing, introducing new versions of popular characters probably meant it had some growing pains to work through. But what I didn't know as a kid is that this story wasn't quite over after the gargoyle was shattered. Next week, we check out a more formal one-shot with the same heroes involved. I'm the Angry Spork, and man, have I got issues.